right, welcome back to the next episode. We're in section 2 of chapter 27, so this is 27.2, and it's going to be about the respiration system. You may have heard that word already this year, respiration, and it had to do with cellular respiration, which was quite a chapter if you don't remember. The glycolysis and the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain doing what they do inside the mitochondria, those processes. But this is very related to it. But just wanted to point out that before we start, respiration does have two different meanings sort of in biology. The first meaning I just mentioned typically has to do with the process of breaking down sugar, metabolizing sugar for energy, getting that energy out and putting that energy to use in your body. All right, so it would be cellular respiration, each cell with the mitochondria doing their job and breaking down the sugar. Well, in order to break down the sugar, though, you need oxygen, and so this is not necessarily a coincidence, but the other context of the word respiration is breathing in, is breathing in or breathing out, breathing in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide. So respiration has to do with getting in oxygen through breathing and also using that oxygen to break down sugar. So it depends on how you use the word. Cellular respiration, again, is the cells breaking down sugar for energy in the presence of oxygen. Just respiration, that's all it's called. I don't know if it's called lung respiration or anything like that, but and this is how you're typically going to hear that word usually. And when people use the word respiration, they're talking about breathing. All right, and so it's important to breathe in oxygen so you can break down sugar. They're very connected, but they mean two different things. And we're talking about breathing in this chapter or this section. We're not talking about cellular respiration. All right, we're just talking about how do we get in oxygen. And if you remember, when we go through cellular respiration, we produce carbon dioxide gas as a byproduct. Well, we got to get that gas out. We can't let that accumulate in our body. So again, breathing serves two purposes: to bring in oxygen and give out carbon dioxide. And so how do organisms do this? Well, they all do it a little bit differently depending on whether you live on land or whether you live in water. And if you live on land, what kind of organism are you? How complex are you? Likewise, if you live in water, there's still going to be some different levels of complexity there. So in this section, we're going to go over all the different ways that organisms can get their oxygen and get rid of their carbon dioxide, because those are two major reasons we need to have a respiration system. And actually, we're looking at animals here, so we're looking at the way animals do this, not other organisms. There are other unique organisms, but we're in the animal kingdom here. All this, both chapter 27 and 28 are all animal kingdom systems in the animal kingdom. And so, all right, so without that being said, let's go ahead and switch over to our PowerPoint here. Let me minimize this screen and get to my, and I'm going to try to answer some of these assessment questions too as I go along. I want to make sure to tap into all those assessment questions so that if you're watching this video to get homework help, you can easily get the answers to those, and I'll point that out when I make those answers available to you. Okay, here's our key questions. What characteristics do the respiratory structures of all animals share? There's going to be some key characteristics that we're going to go over. We're also going to look at how aquatic animals breathe and how do land animals breathe. So that's essentially where we're going to be drawing the lines or making our boxes here. We always try to put things in nice and neat boxes, right? It helps us to organize information and stuff like that. So, but there's always, these are man-made boxes that we're putting here. There's, a little bit of flexibility even between the two, right? We're going to talk about amphibians, which are kind of land and aquatic animals, right? So, but the point is that's going to be where we draw the line. All right, so let's first look at the key structures, this first question, and then we'll look at the difference between aquatic and land animals. Gas exchange, real important, guys, for gas exchange is that it happens across a moist, semi-permeable membrane. Right? Gases don't just diffuse into your cells unless that cell membrane is selectively permeable, which we already know it to be. We've already discussed that in chapter 7 when we looked at the cell. We talked about how the cell is selectively permeable. for materials, it'll allow some materials in, some materials out. Well, gases, they just diffuse. They just simply diffuse in or out based on concentration. But we do need it to be semi-permeable so that they can do that. They need to be allowed to come and go as they please. They also need to be moist. There needs to be water. Well, they need to be moist, right? There needs to be some H2O available. I don't want to say water, because it sounds like they need to be like drenched in water. That's not the case. In fact, you don't want your lungs full of water. That'd be a bad thing. You're drowning. But they need to be moist. Otherwise, the gases can't dissolve into the liquid. Gases need, if gases are going to diffuse, they first need to be dissolved in liquid. All right. And the third thing is you need a whole lot of surface area. A whole lot of surface area. Okay. So large surface area of moist, selectively permeable membrane is the key. Okay. Remember, respiratory structures, they need to always provide, regardless of what animal you are, it needs to provide a large surface area of moist, selectively permeable membrane. All right, and that's going to help to maintain the, again, concentrations of oxygen and CO2 on either side of the respiratory membrane, promoting what we call diffusion. Now, if you don't remember what diffusion is, the way that works is like this. Basically, if you have an area of high concentration of particles and an area of low concentration of particles, and they're separated by this membrane, which will allow those particles to cross, this would be a semi-permeable membrane, meaning that those gas particles are allowed, right? Not every particle, depends. That's what semi-permeable means. Some particles can come and go, some can't. In this case, gases can. So these red dots, if you let this sit here for long enough, the red dots are going to move over so that it can be equal on both sides. That's always trying to happen in nature. Gases and matter, period, wants to go from high concentration, even energy is the same way. It's a really neat, interesting concept. But temperature, hot regions of high temperature will also want to, again, like equalize. If you had a hot temperature here and a cold temperature here, the hot temperature, the energy in those particles would move over, and you'd get an equilibrium. This is called equilibrium when it's the same. But we're talking about gas particles, so let's stick to that. So this is just called simple diffusion. We don't need any proteins to help carry these over or anything like that. This is not active transport. There's no ATP energy required. This is just passive transport. Okay, simple diffusion, and that occurs across a semi-permeable membrane. But I know we see water here, but if there was no water there, like there's no, typically there's no necessarily water in your lungs, but there is H2O, because those surfaces need to be moist. That semi-permeable membrane needs to be moist so that the gases can dissolve in the liquid, in the H2O, so you can have a solution of gases, and then they can dissolve across the membrane. All right. Okay. Oh yeah, large surface area. Let's address that real quick. This is real key, and I don't think everyone. A lot of people don't really get this, and it took me a while to kind of understand this too when I was younger. But here's a picture of some lungs, all right? So here you have your trachea, and your trachea will branch into your left and right lungs, and as it branches into what we call bronchial tubes, and those bronchial tubes branch even further and further into smaller tubes and smaller tubes and smaller tubes, until eventually you end up in little tiny structures called alveoli, which we'll talk about towards the end. But the whole point of that is to increase surface area. If you just look at the lungs like this, you might think, okay, here's your lung surface. You could calculate that, right? And just measure length times width, and you'd have the surface of your lungs. But the surface of your lungs, surface area of your lungs, is actually way greater than that. And a really interesting way of showing that is with a picture. And I can show you. Let's look at this one. Let's say we were bringing gas into this cube here. What would the surface area be where the gas could exchange? And remember, we need to do this quick. Especially if you're moving around, if you're jogging or exercising, you need oxygen quick. You don't have time to waste. You need as much surface area as possible for the most oxygen you can get in any one breath. Well, if this was the cube that we were considering, it'd just be 1 times 1. That would be the surface area of this square. Now, of course, it has 6 sides, so technically the oxygen could diffuse across this side of the cube, this side of the cube, the top of the cube, the bottom. So it would be 6 times 1 for a grand total of 6 cubic centimeters. That would be the 6 square centimeters would be the surface area. We're not doing volume here. It's my bad. We're doing this surface times 6 because there's 6 of those surfaces. All right. That's why I think most people can get this confused, is they confuse it with volume. We're not calculating volume here. In fact, the volume of all 3 of these cubes is the same. Okay? But check this out. The surface area, we can go from 6 to 60 million square centimeters. How do we do that? Well, by adding more surface. How do you add more surface? Well, if we took this cube and you had little cubes inside of it, then you have a whole lot more surfaces on those little cubes to consider. And if you did the math, you could end up with 60 square centimeters, because you'd have 60 cubes there. Or if you had a situation like this where the cubes are so small you couldn't even see them unless you had a microscope, every single one of those little cubes that we can barely see here, you just can't see them. Like, they're all, you see how these cubes have fallen out and they're on the ground? These cubes have fallen out and they're on the ground too, but they're so small they don't look like cubes. It just looks like mess. But those are actually little bitty tiny cubes that all have surfaces, 6 surfaces to be exact. And those 6 surfaces times whatever the area of one of the surfaces is, times however many of those little bitty cubes are in there, would be your surface area. That's why you end up with such a huge number. And so that's what's going on with your lungs, is we're trying to increase surface area so that we get the maximum potential surface area for gas diffusion to occur. And then just a reminder that this would be a good test question, those surface areas need to be moist and selectively permeable. All right, moving on. Let's look at how aquatic animals do it. So aquatic animals like fish are going to use gills, and you've probably seen gills, and you can see how there's like layers of gills. There's like 1, 2, 3, and you might already be thinking in your head, oh, okay, that's how they increase surface area, because there's like the front side of the gill and there's the back side of that one gill. Well, then you look at the next gill, it also has a front and a back side, and then so there's like little layers of gills. And yes, that does increase surface area, but check this out. Gill surface is crazy. Those gills are actually like little bitty, there's like little bitty fingers, and each one of those little fingers has a front and a back and a top and a side. Check this out though. Each one of those little fingers also has these little like little blades on it that also have a left side and a right side. The amount of surface area on gills is crazy. You can't even see it. Like if you were wanting to see these little lamella, they're called lamella, you'd have to like get a microscope to see that. But that's a surface that gas can potentially diffuse across, go in or out of a bloodstream, right? So it's all about blood flow too. This is very important. If you don't have blood flow, there's no point of having a respiratory structure. So in fact, a lot of times you'll hear, that's why you hear the terms cardiovascular, because, you'll hear the people that are talking about exercise, things like that. They'll be talking about your heart rate and your breathing rate at the same time, and how important it is to breathe while you also exercise. Your heart and your lungs, they work together. And you'll see when we do the circulatory system section that we'll talk about how the heart is designed in us to do something very special with the lungs, because the lungs and your circulatory system work together. You're breathing in oxygen, but then you got to carry that oxygen somewhere. So that's all about the circulatory system. So stay tuned for that. But for right now, we want to get as much oxygen into the blood as we can. So again, we need a ton of surface area. And these gill filaments are so interesting on how they're even broken down even further into these little lamella. I thought that was kind of interesting. And here's a good picture of it too. You can see in the lamella, you can have, your oxygen-rich blood, which then will eventually be oxygen poor. So these are the little capillaries, which are tiny blood vessels inside those lamella. We'll talk about blood vessels and capillaries later on when we get to that section. But That's a cool picture of the lamella. This would be the water flowing. These arrows represent the water flowing past the lamella. And that's important too, isn't it? In fact, that's one of the questions that's in the assessment is why would aquatic animals actively pump water across their gills? Well, it's so that you can keep getting oxygen into these blood vessels. All right, if you pull the oxygen out of the water that's here and leave the water there, there's no more oxygen in that water. You want to get that water out of the way and get some new, fresh, oxygenated water in there so that you can have that oxygen diffuse into the capillaries, right? So I noticed that was one of the questions, was why do some animals actively pump water over their gills, right? And maybe you can answer that however you want. Maybe they're stationary animals and they can't do much swimming, and so that's the only way they're going to get water to move. Fish that swim, they're constantly swimming into fresh oxygenated water because they'll get some water across their gills and they're moving right on to the next section of water, and it's going to be fresh, full of oxygen, so they don't have to worry about actively pumping. But if you ever notice if a fish is stressed out or it's something's going on and it needs more ATP for whatever reason that's active, whether it's digesting food and it's just that part of the day, and they're not hunkered down like they'll sometimes do at night, you'll see when they're active, whether they're reproducing and they're all excited, happy, or whatever, for whatever reason, these gills, the operculum, that the kind of a bony structure that the gills sit in, that thing will be moving like back and forth, and that's to pump water across those gill filaments. And so you can see that when the metabolic rate is high, when fish are actively metabolizing and breaking down, again, remember, sugars, when fish are breaking down sugars for ATP, when they need energy, they got to get oxygen just as fast as they are breaking down sugar. Remember, one molecule of oxygen or glucose, 1 molecule of glucose requires 6 molecules of oxygen. And so there you go. So fish actually don't even breathe through their mouth, do they? It's just a muscular pump that will help pull water in, and then it goes across the gills. But they don't really breathe in through their mouth. They pump water in that way, though. So essentially, they kind of are breathing in, but they're really just moving water across. Whereas we move air across. Well, we don't move air across our gills because we don't even have gills. So we'll talk about us in just a second. Let's stay on the aquatic animals for a second here. So again, they use gills. Those are called gills. If you were to answer that question, they use gills. And that would be for the invertebrates and most of the aquatic chordates. Most of the aquatic chordates. Chordates is like a vertebrate. So you have invertebrates that don't have a backbone, and you have vertebrates that do have a backbone, but vertebrates, a better word for that is chordates. That would be a phylum, actually. That would be a phylum. Remember, domain, kingdom, phylum. We're in the animal kingdom in the chordate phylum. Aquatic chordates, like fish, they have a backbone, right? So they're a chordate. So a lot of aquatic chordates and aquatic invertebrates will use gills, but here's a distinction. And this is one of your questions, by the way, so I'm emphasizing it. A distinction is that reptiles and mammals don't use gills, they use lungs. And so come down here to this key question. Key answer. Aquatic reptiles and aquatic mammals, such as whales, elephant seals, if you remember from your biology trip, they use lungs. They use lungs instead, and they hold their breath underwater. Lungs are organs that exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide between blood and air. And so with gills, you're exchanging oxygen across the cells between blood and liquid water. Gills is between blood vessels and water. Lungs are between blood vessels and air. And so here's the distinction with aquatic animals. It's going to be that the reptiles and the mammals, like whales, again, and sea lions or elephant seals, are going to use lungs. Okay, so now let's look at terrestrial animals, which are basically just land animals. Terrestrial is the opposite, not the opposite of aquatic, but it's the contrast to aquatic. What type of respiratory structures are you going to see in terrestrial animals? Let's do the same thing as we did in the last, when we talked about aquatic animals. Let's differentiate between the invertebrates and the vertebrates. How about that? That's a great way to draw another line, if you will. So the respiratory structures of invertebrates, right? What kind of invertebrates do we know that live on land? Well, like spiders and insects. Do they have a backbone? Absolutely not. So they're invertebrates. They don't have a vertebrate. They do different things. So one of the things they can do is simply just use their skin. That doesn't sound very efficient, and you're right, it's not, because skin doesn't have a very large surface area. Oh, check this out. This is really interesting. Speaking of which, did you know, fun fact, see if I can find it. A fish using its gills where is it at? I don't know if I can find the picture, but it's okay, because even if I don't find the picture, I can still just say it using the picture of the gill. Basically, man, I wish I would have saw it. Oh, maybe it is here. Yep. The gills, with those, again, finely divided gill filaments and lamella, they provide a very large surface area, enough that it's actually 60 times larger than the body surface of the fish. So if you were to look at the fish and calculate the surface area of the skin, it wouldn't be that much. It would be 60 times less than the surface area of the gills. You think that, how is that possible, whereas the skin looks like it's larger than the gills? It is, because we're talking about surface area, not volume. You have to be very careful. It's a concept many people can't wrap their head around, but hopefully you can. All right, we're looking at surface area here, but what this is saying here is that some invertebrates literally just use their skin. Not super efficient, by the way, but they will do that. Mantle cavities, book lungs, or tracheal tubes. So let's go back again. We have skin, we have mantle cavities, which mantle cavities are going to be like for snails. Like if you see a snail or a mollusk, like a shellfish or something like that, they basically have that mantle shell type structure. They have a mantle, and then inside the mantle, just below it, there'll be a mantle cavity where there'll be some gills. See some gills there? Here's a shellfish where you have your mantle here, and then just underneath the mantle you have a set of gills here. You have a set of gills there underneath the mantle, in a mantle cavity. So and then we have book lungs. Book lungs are on a lot of different arachnids or spiders. You'll commonly hear that term. Spiders are going to use kind of like gills. They're like gills, but we call it a book lung. They're basically gills for air, if you can think about it that way. It's the way I always think about them. Book lungs are kind of like gills, but they're not in water. They're in air. And then other insects like grasshoppers and such will use a pretty cool system of tubes called tracheal tubes that kind of go all throughout the organism's body and provide air directly to the cells right there. Now, of course, it still has to diffuse into blood and then it crosses the cell membrane and all that. But the point of the tracheal tubes is that the blood doesn't necessarily have to do so much of the carrying. The tubes will do a lot of the carrying of the gas, right? You know, decreasing some of the demand on the circulatory system for gas exchange. And then so you have these tracheal tubes, and then at the end of the tubes you have what are called spiracles, all right? And so you can read that. It will also help clarify how insects use those tracheal tubes. Okay, now what about for vertebrates, though? That would be us. Let's do some talk about us now, since we're probably the most important species. So, in my opinion. But we have a very, very, very highly developed system. The book it likes to use evolution here is to give them credit for how, in fact, if you look at the next page, they talk about how amphibians have evolved to have this purple structure here that would end up being like this purple structure that would eventually end up being like this purple structure as these organisms evolved over millions and millions of years. But I obviously don't believe that. I believe that God just created us slightly different, not slightly different, but he didn't reinvent the wheel. He used the same kind of system, which if you remember, what's the system? Large surface area, selectively permeable membrane, and moist surface area. Those are the 3 requirements. Don't forget that. That's key. But the starting with the most basic here, you have let's just read this. Let's read this answer here. But all the terrestrial vertebrates, remember we're talking about vertebrates here, like reptiles, birds and mammals, and the land stages of most amphibians breathe with lungs. Amphibians are both land-dwelling and water-dwelling, is a good way to think about those amphibians. There's actually a different way to actually classify amphibians because some of them don't live in water and some of them live in land all the time anyways, but it has to do with where they're born, whether they're born in water or born on land. But again, all the terrestrial vertebrates, reptiles, birds, and mammals are going to use lungs. There's a little bit difference in the types of lungs though, and so it's, again, the amphibians is going to be the most basic. They basically just have a large sac here with some ridges. It says a typical amphibian lung is little more than a sac with ridges. And what do those ridges do? Increase surface area. They increase surface area. Remember, if you just had this sac here, you could measure the surface area of that membrane of the sac, but if you gave it little folds, then the sac from far away would look like it's the same size, like volume-wise, but the surface area would be much greater. Now, reptiles are going to have like divisions, so it's like mini sacs in one essential big sac, if you catch my drift here. Reptilian lungs, they're going to be divided into chambers. Again, that's going to increase the surface area. That's what all these divisions are doing, is increasing surface area. Mammalian lungs, our lungs, or the lungs of the whales or the elephant seals in water, lungs are going to use what we call alveoli. And alveoli are really interesting little bubble-like looking structures that increase surface area. So your trachea will come down. Again, it'll branch off into your bronchioles, and then they get smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually they get to these sacs called alveoli sacs. And within the alveoli, you have little small alveoli sacs here. All right, and the way that works is you have so much surface area on each one of these little alveolar sacs. Here's a good one. And around those alveolar sacs, you have blood vessels. And those blood vessels are there to pick up oxygen and drop off CO2. Okay? And so you can't even see these. They're so microscopic. But in fact, here's an awesome picture of some lungs that do show the branching, but you can't really see the alveoli very well. You'd have to have probably a microscope to see it a whole lot better, but you can kind of see at the tips. You have little structures there. Did you know, this is interesting, the surface area of your lungs is about 80 times what? Probably your skin, I would guess. Tennis court. I was wrong. No, wait. It probably is your skin, but typical human lungs pack in a surface bigger than a tennis court. That would make more sense. If you were to stretch out all the surface area of your alveoli and lay it out, it'd be about the size of a tennis court, which might be about 80 times bigger than the surface of your skin. There it is, yep. All right, so there you have it. Alveoli are going to provide an enormous surface area for gas exchange. Mammalian lungs are hands down the most efficient way of breathing. Especially for really, really high metabolic rates. Metabolism is just a fancy word for breaking down sugar. Cellular respiration, if you will, is the synonym for metabolism. All right, bird lungs is the last one we need to discuss, because I think that is asked here in the... no, they don't ask you here, do they? but I will on the test. I'll ask about the bird lungs. Bird lungs are really interesting. The only way I can show that is with a picture here, so hopefully you've watched this video. The way bird lungs work is because they're always flying. What they'll do is they just need a one-way flow. They don't have to inhale necessarily and exhale. They sort of do, but like the muscles move of their rib cage, and their rib cage opens or whatever to allow air come in, and then it closes and push air out. But really, air only moves across the lung once. Air only moves across the lungs once, and then it gets pumped out. So air is always moving. Fresh air is always moving across the lungs. Every breath, exhale or inhale. In fact, you might hear people say this, that birds actually breathe. Air goes into the lungs when they exhale, and air goes out of the lungs when they inhale, or air goes out of the bird when they inhale. It's like the opposite, and that's sort of true, but I don't like to think about it that way. Oh, this is a really cool picture. I never saw this. Oh, neat! It's animated too. Sweet. That is so cool. Right? You can see the air coming in. Oh, I'll leave this on the Google Classroom so you guys can find this and look at it. But this is really cool animation showing the air come in and the air come out. Sort of. I don't know. I think we got a couple flaws there, but yeah, yellow is oxygenated air. Red is going to be the deoxygenated air. And you can see the yellow is going into the blood vessels because the oxygen is being picked up by the bloodstream. Alright, here you can see oxygenated air coming in, and then it goes through the tubes, and then it leaves the tubes through those spiracles that I was telling you about at the end of the tracheal tubes. Alright, I think that's going to be it for this section. Stay tuned for the next video on the circulatory system. We are going to do a little bit of an extension on the circulatory system because it's so important. And what I want you guys to be able to take away from that chapter is the four-chambered heart, and being able to know those terms and how the four-chambered heart works. And the book doesn't do a super great job, I think, on going into that, at least for this chapter. And so I will probably even go get a heart that I can dissect and open up here in my little studio and show you guys the chambers, and I'll give you probably a little bit of an extra assignment there too, where you have to make a map of the blood flow through the heart. Alright, well, thank you for watching.